Well, just how many versions of this show are there? More importantly, how many versions of you? I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, I found an interesting story over at the NBCnews.com website on a feature that they call Mock, not M-O-C-K, but rather M-A-C-H. Under the headline, "The Weirdest Idea in Quantum Physics is Catching On. There may be endless worlds with countless versions of you." Now, that's good news for all the Bill Whittle fans out there. But Bill, as you probably know, because you have quite a scientific bent to you, that way back in the day, about 1926, an Austrian physicist named Erwin Schrodinger popularized the idea that in the quantum realm, in effect, objects exist in a smudge of probability, snapping into focus only when observed. Well, there is a scientist that was interviewed by this NBC news story who's building upon that. His name is Sean Carroll, and Sean is basically saying that that there may be almost infinite versions of you. Now, he's not willing to go and commit to that there are infinite versions of you. There may be no other versions of you, but there's probably not 5 other versions of you. But certainly it's a large number. Meanwhile, Bill, Roger Penrose at Oxford University calls this idea reductio ad absurdum and says and even though his former collaborator Stephen Hawking called the many worlds theory self-evidently true. So, Bill, this seems like a fundamental shakeup of our idea of ourselves as a unitary entity. And I wonder what you think the consequences would be if it turns out that Sean Carroll and folks like him are correct.
Well, the first thing that needs to be said is if he is in fact correct, the consequences for us will be nil. Those are not universes we can communicate with and that we're not aware of or could ever be aware of. So whether he's right or not is not going to really affect the price of eggs in Milwaukee. But there are 2 things here that are very, very interesting. And as our perception increases, it gets more interesting. Without question, just to lay the foundation, without question, endless scientific experiments have proven without a doubt that the act of observing something changes that something. When you look at something, you change it. You basically force the quantum state of nature to make a decision. It's in that famous Schrodinger cat state of alive and not alive until you open the box and then make a look, and your observation basically compresses these probability waves down, and the universe has to make a decision.
Now, Bill, let me just stop you there, because I've found that when we are talking about abstract concepts like the quantum realm and this whole idea of Schrodinger's cat, that I found that it's almost inescapable that you must use language like you just did. The universe made a decision, as if there is some, let's say, massive, omnipotent, omniscient, divine presence who has to make a call.
We'll get to that in a minute. Don't let me forget that. I should have been more accurate in my phrasing. Our observation causes the universe to react in such a way that it looks like the universe has made a decision. We make the decision. We decide to do the observation, and the observation influences the state of matter. This is not theory, this is absolutely true, influences the actual state of matter. And so when I say the universe makes a decision, it's the act of observation, which is a volitional thing on our part, that makes the universe basically have to pick one or the other. There's so much to say about this. And the one thing I'd like to say, and I'm so happy to get a question like this, because I find this stuff just interesting as hell. The first thing I want to say in terms of this for people is to understand this. I did an afterburner once called Howie about a bird that I'd adopted, a little baby bird. And in that video, I was holding the bird on my finger, and I said, I have a vague idea of how all this works. I know how light is being stimulated from, either LEDs or glowing filaments, and it's reflected into a camera, and a lens is cunningly used to shape and I basically outlaid the whole reason in a general sense of how you were able to see an image on the internet. And then I pointed to the bird and I said, the bird doesn't know any of this. The bird doesn't know that there are signals that are moving right through us all at the same time, from cell phones and radios and cosmic rays, neutrinos, all of that stuff. We've been able to figure that out. And that is an astonishing achievement for any species, astonishing. But this is the critical point. When you talk about some of the things that we're going to talk about, you run up against what I call the horsepower limit. In other words, I could take that bird on 100,000 instrument check rides, and I could explain to that bird every single thing about flying a jet to an instrument landing, and it doesn't matter how many times I do it, the bird's not going to get it, and the chimp's not going to get it either. I cannot train a chimp to fly an instrument approach. It's just not possible. It's hard enough to train pilots to fly an instrument approach. But my point is this, the chimp's a better example. The chimpanzee is up against the barrier of its actual ability to think. It just doesn't have the horsepower. It's not there. There's not enough neural connections in a chimp's brain to do something as complex as fly an instrument approach, just as an example.
I'm starting to get the sense that I'm the chimp when it comes to this whole issue.
I didn't want to say it, but draw your own conclusions. But my point is this. Some of the things that we talk about are based on evidence of what we see experimentally. And we can make models and we can talk about things, but some of this stuff is simply not going to be believable to you. It is going to, and I don't mean you, I mean to a human. It's going to exceed your ability to imagine. And just because it exceeds your ability to imagine doesn't mean it's not real. It just means that you have hit the horsepower limitations of this hunk of gray jelly we have up here. So,
but by contrast, Bill, just because something does not exceed my ability to imagine it doesn't mean that it is so. Do you understand what I'm saying? Just because because Sean Carroll, for example, who's a physicist at California Institute of Technology, because he can imagine it doesn't mean that it's real.
No, absolutely right. But the reason that this theory has weight behind it is because while some of the things that I'm just going to talk about in a moment are incomprehensible, the model we can make sense of, and the model is based on minute little observations, and these minute little observations are understandable, put together in such a way to make sense out of them all. They lead to conclusions that simply seem impossible, but that conclusion seems impossible to you because of the horsepower limit. I've given this a fair amount of thought. So basically, here's what this universe theory says. It says that there might be an infinite number of me and an infinite number of you. That's cool. Great. Basically, what it's saying is every time the universe makes an interaction, observation of it makes a decision and the universe goes off in different ways. But that also means that there are not only infinite numbers of me, there are infinite numbers of water molecules and infinite numbers of waves coming across on infinite number of beaches. And any single difference in the position of those two molecules should spin off a new universe.
So, Bill, I need to stop you again here because Albert Einstein himself struggled with this idea after, studying his buddy Erwin Schrodinger's ideas. And basically, he was asking questions like, well, whatever, if you're talking about an object in space that doesn't appear at a particular location until it's observed, so to speak, what happened to all the other locations where it could have appeared? And how could it possibly depend on whether somebody was looking at it? And believe it or not, that Gordian knot seemed to have been cut in 1957 when a Princeton student named Hugh Everett III came up with this, what you are just describing here, this radical explanation.
Multiple worlds.
Really, it's not that one event or another occurs depending upon observation. It's that all possible events always occur.
Aha. Now we're down to it. So there are two things that the horsepower limitation prevent us from believing, even though experimentally these things have a good case of being true. One of them is that every single difference in a position of an atom in a body of water throughout the entire universe creates a new universe, an entire new universe. And your horsepower limitation says that's impossible. There's no place to store all of those universes. And if you come to a place where you realize there's no place to store all of this stuff, that means you have run up against the horsepower limit of infinity. You know what infinity is. You understand the concept of infinity, but you can't get your head around the concept. You simply cannot accept that there could be room enough for every single molecular difference in every single part of every single atom in the universe could cause an entirely different universe to spin off. We don't have the horsepower for that. But experimentally, it seems to be the case. And the other thing, and the more important thing that we don't have the horsepower for, is we don't have the horsepower to really understand infinity, which is space, and we don't have the horsepower to understand eternity, which is time. There's a good deal of evidence, and gets stronger every day, that time, as we understand it, is a reflection of our ability to deal with the motion of the world through the fourth dimension. It is essentially an artifact, the way we see time as an artifact. I'm not going to get into all of this. God knows I would love to. But basically, and this kind of thinking is almost impossible to get rid of. I struggle with it all the time when I talk about these issues. If time is motion through the fourth dimension, then basically this model that you're talking about assumes that the universe, I almost said, was created, but it wasn't created. Forget creator for a moment. It's not like there was nothing and then the universe became. It's like it was always there. It will always be there. Who created it? There was no creator. There's nothing before it. Well, there must have been something before it. No, there was nothing before it. The universe is expanding. Okay, inside this bubble is real space as we know it. Great. What's on the other side of the bubble? There is no other side of the bubble. Well, there's got to be another side of the bubble. Well, there's not. And you don't have the horsepower to understand that there's nothing on the other side of this wall. When I say nothing, I don't mean vacuum. I don't mean white void. I mean, it's nothing. These are the things that we can't get our heads around.
Now, Bill, the beauty of a theory like this is that a guy like Sean Carroll he cannot answer the, of course, core question that anybody hearing this, any layperson hearing him talk about this would immediately say, well, if there are other worlds coming into existence, is it possible to see them? Is it possible to go to them? Is it possible to participate in them? And Carroll says this, they once the other worlds come into existence, they go their own way. They don't interact. They don't influence each other in any form. Crossing over is like traveling faster than the speed of light, something you can do. And
they're inaccessible.
Yeah. And so that makes the most beautiful scientific theory of all because it is virtually untestable. And the kind of people that would embrace the quantum realm, you may find many of them are the same kind of people who would dismiss the idea of, let's say, an omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful creator God as something that is asinine and must go on nothing but faith because you can't test it.
There's something called, oh my gosh, the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological thing. It's got nothing to do with physics. And the Dunning-Kruger effect basically says that the less you know about something, the more you think you know about something. In other words, you're too stupid to understand how complex the issue is. And the perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect is to watch the failed auditions on American Idol, where these people, these unbelievably, unspeakably bad singers, genuinely believe that they're as good as the best singers in the world. They have so little knowledge and so little talent, they don't realize how far short they are. And this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Hat tip to William Hung.
And my experience as a person who was for many years a radical atheist and a complete materialist in terms of how things are built is that there is a very high level of Dunning-Kruger effect going on where people, very smart people, have come to the conclusion that because we understand this, and this, there is nothing beyond the horsepower barrier, which is a term I've come up with and I happen to like. There's nothing beyond the horsepower barrier. That means that anything that's in the universe can eventually be understood by us with the correct theory. But you cannot understand eternity. You can use it as a tool. And if we have sometimes we'll say the map is not the territory. So if I showed you a map of Texas, for example, Scott, and I put it out on the table, I'd say to you, what is this? You'd say, it's Texas. I said, not Texas. There are billions of little rocks in Texas, and there are millions and billions of little scorpions under every one of these rocks. That's Texas. This is a piece of paper. And so we say the map is not the territory. The model is infinitely simpler than the thing it's trying to capture. And in a real sense, nevertheless, a map of Texas is useful in terms of finding your way around Texas, but it's not Texas. So here's the point. It's starting to look to me like the entire universe, and this is the part where we again, there's a horsepower barrier thing, where the entire universe, including everything that we call the past and everything we call the future, exists at once, simultaneously. And strangely enough, free will is built into that because the free will was built into it, I almost said as it was created, but it was already there. I know this is getting very esoteric, but I can give you a couple of quick little examples. Just a quick example. If I were to hand you an album of Frank Sinatra's greatest hits, right? and an old LP album. And I hand you this and I say, this is Frank Sinatra's greatest hits. And you put the thing on the record player and you start playing it. And I say to you, which part of the record is real? You would look at me like I was nuts. What do you mean? I said, well, what part of the record is real? We say it's all real. Correct. But you're only listening to 1 second of it, well, 1 microsecond of it at a time. You're only listening to the notes that are being played because that's where the needle is. But if you pick up the needle and move it back a bit, you can play those same things again and again and again. There's no part of the record that's more real than any other part of the record. There's only where the needle is. And that's how people are starting to think about time. Our view of time is we are the needle. We're not able to move the needle. We're kind of stuck because of our horsepower limitations to glide down this groove. But to say that this thing is behind us is gone and the part of the record ahead of us is not here yet is not true. We can't perceive it. So what this multiple universe thing does is it creates something for me that I never thought I would be able to really fully explain, and I've probably blown it here too. But the more we get into quantum, the more I become convinced of a higher intelligence. And I can close this argument simply by saying this. Without question experimentally, when we observe nature, we change nature on the quantum level. By observing something, we change it. And if you put a camera even observing something, it will change the experimental results. So my understanding is this. If I am able with my chimpanzee brain to set up a situation where I am forcing nature to make a decision based on the observations of it, then for me to believe that I understand everything that there is for me to assume that this, cantaloupe-sized hunk of gray matter is the most powerful thinking machine in the universe. There's nothing bigger than my brain. There's nothing more complex than my brain. My brain is the be-all and end-all of all existence, which I find to be nonsense and unspeakable arrogance. So if people of our limited intelligence, consciousness is a better word, are capable of influencing nature by observing it, by looking at it, then certainly a more advanced consciousness should be able to influence nature to such a degree that it can move nature around any way it wants to. Think things into being, think them out of being. And to ignore that is, to me, the great arrogance of the scientific, materialistic, atheistic position that I was in thrall of for so much of my life. I thought that there's nothing beyond my ability to understand. And the arrogance of that is shocking. Multiple dimensions seem to be experimentally proven. Probably 11 of them is a pretty good number. And I live in the third one, moving through the fourth one. And I somehow am able to exclude all of this stuff. The button on this, Scotty, and for those of you who are looking for a political message, I apologize for this one, but I love talking about it. The button on it is this. If this theory is correct, and I think there's certainly mathematical evidence that it could be correct, then essentially consciousness, it's not like consciousness evolves out of the universe. The universe evolves out of consciousness. It may be true, this is called the anthropic principle, may be true that if all we had on Earth were humans who could look up in the stars and see little sparks as campfires, then that's all the stars really were. And as we became more sophisticated in our observations, in the same way on that quantum level, we're basically forcing the universe to become more complex because we're able to ask sharper questions of it. And that is a conclusion which certainly gives me hope. I can just tell you what I personally believe at this point based on the scientific evidence of an amateur who has some background in this. I believe that the universe has always existed, will always exist, that it was created entire and has always been created entire. I believe that the free will choices that I make in my life were built into that. See, I said were, will be, are. No, those things are made up terms. That all of the free will decisions that are made by me, by my consciousness, are part of this enormously complex 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, 11-dimensional structure that we call the universe. And if we are capable, using our primitive ape minds, of which I am inordinately proud, of affecting nature by watching it and looking at it, then it doesn't take much of an imagination, for me anyway, to be able to say that a consciousness beyond my very, very limited horsepower in the way that my brain was beyond that little bird's brain is capable of creating matter and interactions simply by deciding that it wanted to.
As the scripture says, to the Lord, 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years. It sounded like you were almost describing the needle on the record player analogy. The needle thinks it's making beautiful music, but the groove has been cut, and the hand that moves the tone arm is invisible most of the time.
And for those of you who are grieving losses and so on, and many of us are, and all of us will be, if this theory is correct, then the people, the pets, the things, the times you loved are not gone. They're there. You've moved, your consciousness has moved, but those moments are there. They'll always be there. They always will be there. They always have been there. And perhaps when we shuffle off this mortal coil, we will have the ability, perhaps guided by a loving hand, to be able to revisit not only the sections of this enormously complex structure that made up our lives, but maybe then we might be able to be taken by the hand and show other ones too, better ones perhaps. And so I believe that genuinely believe that experiences, places, people don't leave. And if all of this is true, if all of it is true, if our existence basically carves a small groove into the universe that has always been there and always will be, then our obligation really as people is to make sure that the groove we cut today is the best one we possibly can.
Well, it's time for us to shuffle off this episode of Bill Whittle Now. We're grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com who have made it possible, and also to our friends over at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest, who have engaged in a co-promotional effort with us so that more people can find out more about the Patriot Post and more of their readers can find out more about BillWhittle.com. We're grateful to those folks there. We'll provide a link to the Patriot Post in the description below. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.